video, I'm going to review Unit 2 for the midterm, which is all about biodiversity. I've listed the most important topics from Unit 2, and we're going to take a little bit of time and go into them step by step. I suggest following along with your Unit 2 notes that I provided on OneNote. Highlight the things that I say that are important, and then of course add in your own notes from lecture to get a really complete view of Unit 2. Wrong way. The first thing we're going to talk about with biodiversity is what exactly biodiversity is. And when you say biodiversity, it's a very broad term and it means a lot of different things. So it's important to be very specific when you talk about it. What specifically are you talking about? So biodiversity, there's three main types: genetic diversity, species diversity, and habitat diversity, and they each mean slightly different things. However, in general, with each of those, you want more genetic diversity, more species, more habitat diversity. You'll increase productivity, which increases ability to survive and tolerate stress. So whenever there is some sort of stressor, abiotic or biotic, when you have higher genetic species and habitat diversity, you have a higher chance of overcoming and living through that stress. So let's talk about genetic diversity. Genetic diversity are all the genes and all the physical traits that you see in one population, which we can also call the gene pool. Of course, our physical traits, for the most part, are controlled by our genetics. So the more genetic diversity you have, the more physical traits that you are able to show. And so then if a specific physical trait helps you survive a stress, that will show up in your gene pool. That's what I mean by natural selection. We're selecting for those traits, for those physical traits, which are reflected in our genes, that allow you to survive better, reproduce more, increasing, and that trait will increase over your generations, leading to an increased match between individual and the environment. A population bottleneck is almost the exact opposite of what I just said. It's when your gene pool decreases suddenly and now you have a much smaller population with a much decreased genetic diversity, and now your population can't respond as well to stress. Think about whenever we decrease a population size by overhunting, or maybe there's some sort of environmental condition that they can't survive. So the population shrinks really quickly, and that's of course reflected in their gene pool, decreasing genetic diversity. And now overall, you're unable to respond better to stress because you have less genetic diversity. You have less traits to choose from for natural selection. So overall, the more genetic diversity you have, the better able a population is to handle stress. You have more genes, you have more traits to choose from. So when I talk about species diversity, I mean all of the species in a community. And we can talk about species diversity in two main ways, which are the number of species, which is species richness, and also your evenness, the abundance. Two communities might have the same species richness, but the distribution of those species are different. The species evenness is different. So those two numbers come together and they give you an index called a biodiversity index. We did, I believe, the Simpsons biodiversity index in one of our labs, which compared species richness and relative abundance of species between different habitats. If this topic is confusing to you, I suggest going back and reviewing that lab that we did on species diversity indices. We can also look at dominant versus rare species and their composition in your habitat. And overall, again, which is our theme for this little mini unit, is the more species diversity, the better ability for your community to overcome stress. And the last one is habitat diversity, which are all the characteristics in a habitat. How diverse the habitat is in its abiotic condition. So how diverse is the water level, the temperature, the salinity, the oxygen levels. The more diversity, the more combinations of different characteristics you have, the more species you can support. So the greater your species diversity, so the better able for that habitat to survive and overcome stress. There are a bunch of things. So we increase diversity naturally through mutations. We can decrease diversity through a couple ways. If you're continuously stressing an environment, disrupting it, think about like maybe a road is going through an environment, or you're drilling in for oil in an environment. That's a continuous environmental stress that's going to decrease your biodiversity. The more extreme that stress is, the bigger the decrease you're going to see to biodiversity. If you have a habitat that's isolated, and we're going to look at island biogeography in just a second and its implications for this, but when a habitat is isolated, or a species or community is isolated, that's going to decrease its biodiversity. The introduction of invasive species, potentially species that are better competitors than your natural native species, that's going to decrease your biodiversity, because you're going to end up with more of those invasives than your natural species that are supposed to be there. And climate change is also a really big decrease biodiversity, because nature then, and this changing in climate, is going to be selecting for species that are able to deal with this fast change, and selecting against species that can't move or that can't adapt. So we're selecting for more generalist species. Overall, generalist feeder species are able to adapt more. They have a wide variety of food sources that they can eat from. So they're able to outcompete specialists during habitat change, during climate change, during all of these environmental stressors. So whenever you have these types of disruptions that will decrease biodiversity, you're going to end up with more generalists, because they can feed on a wide variety of resources, and fewer specialists, which have a harder time adapting because they require specific resources in order to survive. Now we're going to take a shift away. We're going to talk about ecosystem services. So the greater the habitat diversity, the greater number of ecosystem services that a habitat can provide. What is an ecosystem service? An ecosystem service is either an economic, indirect, or direct environmental value that is added by having this ecosystem present. And there are 4 types of ecosystem services: provisional, regulating, cultural, and supporting. And so provisional is basically anything that you can get economic gain from by direct use of that ecosystem. Think about harvesting timber from a forest ecosystem. That is an example of a provisional ecosystem services. Regulating is an indirect use, because you're not directly getting that value added. So it's something like photosynthesis or pollination. It's a natural phenomenon that occurs that you get a benefit from. And then cultural or ethical is a non-material. The best example of cultural is recreation and ecotourism. So you're gaining a value by using it because it's giving you some sort of aesthetic or cultural value. And then supporting is something that incorporates all the other 3 and it sustains life. So think about something like maintenance of the gene pool. So ecosystem services are directly related to biodiversity and the 3 main types, slightly in different ways. And now we got to island biogeography. The island biogeography is a theory by E.O. Wilson, where we looked at ways to increase species richness and how to get maximum species richness. So we look at different island sizes and their distance to the mainland to come up with this. Basically, bigger islands can support more individuals. Smaller islands can support fewer individuals. So bigger islands, we have less extinction. Smaller islands, potentially we have more. And then as we move closer and farther from the mainland, we have more or less extinction. So the closer we are to the mainland, the more new individuals that are going to be migrating in. The farther we are from the mainland, the fewer individuals that are going to be migrating in. So we end up with higher rates of extinction. So if we put those 2 ideas together, how close are we to the mainland and how big is the island, we can figure out how that's going to impact diversity or species richness. So basically, the larger the island, the closer it is to your mainland, the more species richness you're going to see. So why are we talking about islands when I'm talking about biodiversity, when we're talking about habitats? And basically, we've used this idea of island biogeography to talk about creating conservation areas and national parks that are able to really provide enough space so that our animal species that are impacted by humans living nearby, so that we decrease that impact a little bit. So whenever we create a city near a forest ecosystem, we're creating edges. And whenever we have a national park, or some sort of conservation area around around it is all impacted area. So we can think about these conservation areas as our islands. So we want that conservation area to be bigger, and we want that conservation area to be close to another conservation area so that they can exchange individuals back and forth. Ecological tolerance is the range of abiotic conditions that an organism can survive in. So basically, as you move around this ecological gradient, it's going to impact your number of individuals, which is generally your y-axis. So either increasing or decreasing temperature is going to have an impact on the number of individuals of that species that's able to survive. And we can sub out temperature with any environmental gradient, and it's going to have some sort of impact. So while this individual survives best in the middle of whatever the environmental gradient is, it can survive on either end, but just at a less number. In the periphery, it can survive fewer, but you have an increased number of death. And then outside of that zone of tolerance, they're unable to survive. So adaptations allow organisms to survive in areas that maybe they weren't able to survive in before. Environmental changes, whether they are sudden or gradual, threaten a species' ability to survive. So these species either have to change their behavior so they can survive, move to an area where they can survive, or they will die. And it basically depends on how fast that environmental change is happening. If it's happening very fast, it's harder for individuals to do one of those things, and generally they will perish. If the rate of change is slower, then an individual has a chance to either alter their behavior through natural selection or move. So the faster that change is happening, the less the chance that organism is going to survive. And we'll talk about the implications of that in just a second. So if they're going to adapt, if they're going to change their behavior or adapt, there's two main ways they can do it. They can change their outward appearance, and all of that is reflected from their genes. So we've talked about the peppered moth, which normally was white with black specks, but we started burning coal, it darkened the trees, and then the individuals that were white were predated on more, and the individuals that were darker were better adapted, and they reproduced more. So they were able to alter their behavior through their genes, reflected in their outward appearance. Biochemical change, which is just change in an amino acid, which changes the way a protein folds. If you remember that from biology, your amino acids line up and they interact with each other to make a special shape, and that shape is what determines the protein's function. So if the shape is a little different, the protein's going to have a different function. So why are we talking about that right now when we're talking about adaptations? Well, things that are important for environmental science, like pesticide resistant, are based on proteins available. So certain individuals that are not resistant to a pesticide are going to die when you spray pesticides. However, individuals that maybe have a slight mutation to their genes are going to be pesticide resistant, and so they will survive after you spray pesticide, and they'll pass on that advantageous trait for them until the entire population is resistant. We talk more about the pesticide treadmill and the implications, kind of looking at it the other direction from the farmer instead of the perspective of the insect in Unit 5. And we talked a little bit about rate of change. Can the organisms adapt before they perish? The faster the change, the less the chances of them surviving. And so there's two big examples of change that are happening are climate change, which can be slower or faster. Right now it's really, really, really fast as opposed to other times. But the dinosaurs went extinct when really quickly the climate changed, and that's what we're seeing now again here in this 7th extinction. And then also habitat loss, which is a big abrupt change to habitat. So how do these habitats change? Any gradual process that describes the change in a structure of a community over time is called ecological succession, where one type of community is replaced by another over time, and the structure of the community changes over time. We first change the plant community, and that changes the habitat, which changes the wildlife community. And So that whole change, that change in community ecosystem is called ecological succession. And there's two types, and it depends on what's happened to your soil. So if you're starting from bare rock, we call that primary succession, because we have such a far way to go back to that climax community. So you start with bare rock, you have physical and chemical weathering starts to break down that rock into soil, and now plants can colonize it. So we have first lichens, our pioneer species, followed by maybe grasses, and perennials, until that soil has broken down enough where we can have our intermediate species come in. And generally, these guys are more shade intolerant. They require full sun, and those are replaced then by our best competitors, which are shade tolerant trees in the climax community. And all those shifts of our plant community are followed by shifts in our animal community as well. The types of disruptions that lead to primary succession types of disruptions that will leave you with bare rock. Mountaintop removal, volcanic eruption, lava flow, a retreating glacier, all of these go back to bare rock, so that is an example of primary succession. In secondary succession, you do lose your dominant vegetation. So you are pushed back at some point from your climax community or even from your intermediate species community back to a previous point in ecological succession, but not all the way back to bare rock. So you still are changing your community structure, but you don't return to bare rock. You just lose your primary vegetation. So we just saw this weekend were horrible tornadoes, really devastating loss in Kentucky and the Midwest, and all of that is an example of secondary succession where they lost their dominant vegetation, but not the soil. So that's going to be secondary succession. And generally it takes a lot, because you don't start with bare rock, it's a lot shorter process. Where primary succession can take thousands of years, secondary succession only takes a couple hundred. Generally, as you move through your stages of succession, you're increasing biomass, you're increasing biodiversity, and you're increasing your net primary productivity. Bigger trees have greater biomass, have greater photosynthetic potential. And so that's why you see that increase in biomass and your increase in NPP. The more habitats that exist, the greater habitat diversity, the farther along in succession you are, the more species that can survive in that habitat. So generally when you see farther along in ecological succession, you're going to have greater species diversity and habitat diversity as well. And the last thing we're going to talk about are keystone species, which are individuals that are species that have a really big important role in community structure, but they're not necessarily dominant. And so they have cascading impacts all along the community structure, and for a couple different ways. So down below I have a shark, which is a keystone species, and this shark is an example of a predatorial keystone species because the shark affects the quantity of plants and animals in the food chain by controlling the prey, by controlling those manta rays. Manta rays eat a lot of your bottom-dwelling arthropod populations. And if their population gets too big, you're going to have a decrease in your bottom-dwelling population, and the whole ecosystem is going to crash. But the shark maintains that ray population, and so you end up with a stable bivalve and arthropod population. Other examples of this are ecosystem engineers, like alligators that build alligator holes, or beavers that increase the water table. They create or change the habitat in some way to provide a habitat for all of the other individuals living in that ecosystem. And then a mutualist, where you have two species benefit, and without one, the whole food chain will collapse. Think about bees pollinating plants. That's an example of a mutualistic relationship that ends up supporting the entire ecosystem. And then indicator species are species that indicate the character or quality of an ecosystem. Generally, they have a very narrow ecological tolerance. So coral reefs right now are proving to be a wonderful indicator species, showing that our oceans are changing in the turbidity and in the temperature, because those changes in temperature and because those changes in turbidity end up leading to coral bleaching. So if you see areas where corals have been bleached, you know that the water is warmer and there's higher turbidity. Whereas if you see healthy coral reef, you know that the that the oceans are not changing that way. And there's a couple other examples. Another wonderful one are amphibians. Generally indicate estrogen chemicals in the water. They're very sensitive to chemicals in the water and toxins, and they will show you whether a river has been polluted or not. And we will get to talk more about that when we do Unit 7, I believe, which is, or Unit 8, which is terrestrial and aquatic pollution. Look forward to that moving forward. Until then, just review Unit 2. If you have specific questions about this video, please reach out to me as soon as possible. Thank you so much, and we will talk soon.